The scar ran from her left temple to the corner of her mouth, a jagged reminder that some wounds never truly heal. Isabella Marlowe had learned to live with the stares, the whispered conversations that died when she approached, the way children pointed before their mothers pulled them away. But today, in the dusty heart of Dodge City, the shame felt different, heavier, like a stone lodged in her chest that threatened to crush what remained of her spirit. She pressed her fingers against the raised flesh, wishing she could disappear into the Kansas wind. Subscribe to discover how one quiet cowboy's courage changed everything. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Dodge City's main street, casting long shadows between the weathered buildings that lined the dusty thoroughfare. Isabella Marlowe stood at the edge of the wooden sidewalk, her fingers unconsciously tracing the familiar path of scar tissue that marked her face like a map of old pain. The weekly market bustled around her with its usual chaos, merchants hawking their wares, children darting between the legs of horses, women in their finest dresses discussing the latest gossip from back east. But Isabella felt separate from it all, as if she existed behind an invisible wall that kept her forever on the outside looking in. She had come to town for supplies, nothing more. Salt, flour, maybe some ribbon if she could spare the coins. Simple necessities that required her to venture from the safety of her small cabin on the outskirts of town, where the only witnesses to her shame were the prairie grass and the endless sky. But even these brief excursions felt like walking through fire, each curious glance burning deeper than the last. The scar had been with her for 3 years now, a gift from a spooked horse and a poorly placed fence post, but the wound to her spirit felt fresh every single day. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the general store, her arms laden with packages, her eyes immediately finding Isabella's face with that familiar mixture of pity and discomfort. "Oh, Isabella, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How are you managing out there all alone? Such a shame about—" She gestured vaguely toward Isabella's face, as if the scar was something that might be contagious. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, acrid and impossible to escape. Isabella forced a smile, though it felt like cracking glass. "I'm managing just fine, Mrs. Henderson. Thank you for asking." But even as she spoke, she could feel the familiar heat rising in her cheeks, the way her hand wanted to rise and cover the damaged side of her face. She had practiced this conversation 100 times in her mirror, had rehearsed the perfect responses to well-meaning cruelty. Yet standing here in the harsh light of day, surrounded by the normal world that seemed to exist just beyond her reach, every word felt like a lie. The older woman's gaze lingered on the scar, with the kind of fascination people reserved for accidents and tragedies. "Well, you know, dear, there are ways to minimize such things. Powder, perhaps, or a nice hat with a veil. Mrs. Patterson in Wichita knows a woman who does remarkable work with cosmetics. Of course, it would never be the same as—" She trailed off, leaving the unspoken words to fill the space between them like poison. As if Isabella hadn't tried every remedy, every powder, every angle of hat brim that might cast the right shadow. Isabella nodded politely, her throat tight with unshed tears. "I'll keep that in mind." She turned toward the store, desperate to escape the conversation, but Mrs. Henderson's voice followed her like a persistent fly. "You know, dear, perhaps it's for the best. Some things are meant to teach us humility, to keep us from getting too proud. The Lord works in mysterious ways." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and leaving her standing frozen on the threshold of the general store, wondering if she had the strength to take another step into a world that saw her scars as divine punishment. Nathaniel Hayes sat motionless on his horse at the far end of the street, watching the scene unfold with the patience of a man who had learned that the most important moments often happened in the spaces between words. He had been coming to Dodge City for supplies when he noticed the young woman standing alone, her shoulders curved inward like she was trying to make herself smaller, invisible. Even from this distance, he could see the tension in her posture, the way she held herself as if expecting a blow. There was something about her stillness that called to the quiet places in his own heart, the parts of him that understood what it meant to carry wounds that others couldn't see. He had heard the stories, of course. In a town the size of Dodge City, everyone knew about Isabella Marlowe and her scar, though most spoke of it in whispers, as if tragedy might be catching. Some said she had been beautiful once, before the accident. Others claimed she had always been too proud, too independent for her own good, and that the scar was simply life's way of teaching her a lesson. Nate had never paid much attention to such talk. He had his own scars, his own reasons for keeping to the edges of things, but watching her now, he felt something stir in his chest that had been dormant for longer than he cared to remember. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried on the afternoon air, each word sharp enough to cut. Nate had known women like her all his life, women who wielded kindness like a weapon, who could deliver cruelty with a smile and call it Christian charity. He watched Isabella's shoulders tighten with each syllable, saw the way her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the store's door handle. There was a dignity in her bearing that reminded him of wild horses he had known, creatures that had been broken but not conquered, their spirits bent but never truly tamed. The cowboy dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dusty ground with barely a sound. He had never been a man of many words. His father had beaten the chattiness out of him early, and the war had finished the job. But he understood the language of gesture, the way a single action could speak louder than 1,000 speeches. He tied his horse to the hitching post with deliberate care, his movements unhurried despite the urgency building in his chest. Some things couldn't be rushed, especially the kind of courage it took to step into someone else's pain. As he walked toward the general store, Nate could feel the weight of watching eyes, the way conversations paused and resumed in his wake. He was used to being noticed. A man of his size and silence tended to draw attention, but today felt different. Today, every step felt like a choice, every breath like a small act of rebellion against the unspoken rules that governed places like Dodge City. He had spent most of his 33 years learning to read the currents of human cruelty, to navigate around the sharp edges of other people's judgment, but something about the young woman's quiet suffering had awakened a part of him he thought had died somewhere in the mud of Gettysburg. Isabella had finally managed to push through the store's door, but not before Nate caught a glimpse of her face. Not just the scar that everyone seemed so fascinated by, but the eyes above it, dark and deep as prairie wells, filled with a sadness that made his chest ache. He had seen that look before, in his own reflection during the worst nights after the war, when the ghosts of dead friends visited his dreams and left him gasping for air that tasted like gunpowder and regret. It was the look of someone who had learned that the world could be cruel in ways that left marks deeper than any blade, and who had somehow found the strength to keep breathing anyway. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Dodge City, painting everything in shades of amber and regret. Isabella stood at her kitchen window, watching the town come alive with the same careful choreography it had performed every day since she could remember. The baker's wife swept her porch with mechanical precision. The blacksmith's hammer rang out its familiar rhythm, and the children ran to school with their faces bright and unmarked by the kind of sorrow that carved itself into flesh. She touched the scar that ran from her left temple to the corner of her mouth, a jagged reminder of the night her father's drinking had finally found its target in her face rather than the barn wall. Nate's kiss had left something burning in her chest, a warmth that felt dangerous and unfamiliar. She had spent 3 years learning to make herself invisible, to move through the world like a ghost who apologized for taking up space. The women at the general store would lower their voices when she passed, their words floating behind her like smoke. "Poor thing," they would murmur, "such a shame about her face." The men would look away entirely, as if her scarred skin might be contagious, as if acknowledging her existence would somehow diminish their own. But Nate had looked directly at her, had seen the mark that made others turn away, and had pressed his lips to it as if it were something precious rather than something broken. The memory of his touch made her hands shake as she prepared her morning coffee, the simple ritual becoming complicated by the way her heart kept forgetting its steady rhythm. She had built her life around the certainty that she would always be alone, that love was something that happened to other women, women whose faces told stories of joy rather than violence. The scar had become her identity, the thing that defined her in the eyes of everyone who looked at her, and she had learned to wear it like armor, protecting herself from the hope that someone might see past it to the woman underneath. But Nate's kiss had cracked that armor, had left her feeling exposed and terrified and strangely alive. Outside, she could see him walking toward the livery stable, his hat pulled low against the morning sun, his movements carrying the same quiet confidence that had drawn her to him in the first place. He moved through the world like a man who had nothing to prove, who understood that strength came not from the loudness of your voice, but from the steadiness of your presence. The other cowboys would slap each other's backs and laugh too loudly, would drink too much and fight too often, would treat the saloon girls with a mixture of desire and contempt that made Isabella's stomach turn. But Nate was different, had always been different, and watching him now, she felt something unfurling in her chest, like a flower that had been waiting years for the right kind of sunlight. The sound of approaching footsteps made her step back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird trying to escape its cage. She knew those boots, knew the measured pace that spoke of authority and judgment, knew that Sheriff Reed was coming to her door with the same expression he wore when he had to deliver bad news. She smoothed her skirt with trembling hands and touched her hair, making sure it fell across the left side of her face in the way she had perfected over the years. The knock came sharp and official, 3 precise raps that seemed to echo through her small house like gunshots, and she knew that whatever he had come to say would change everything. When she opened the door, Sheriff Reed stood on her porch with his hat in his hands and his face set in the kind of stern lines that had made him feared and respected in equal measure. Behind him, the town continued its morning routine, but she could feel the weight of watching eyes, could sense the way conversations had paused and curtains had twitched as the sheriff made his way to her door. "Miss Marlowe," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never questioned his right to judge others. "I think we need to have ourselves a talk about what happened yesterday, and about the kind of attention you've been drawing to yourself in my town." Sheriff Reed stepped into Isabella's parlor without waiting for an invitation, his presence filling the small space like smoke from a poorly tended fire. He was a man who had learned to use silence as a weapon, to let the weight of unspoken accusations hang in the air until people confessed to crimes they hadn't even committed. Isabella watched him survey her modest home, his eyes taking inventory of her few possessions with the same calculating gaze he used when examining evidence at a crime scene. The morning light streaming through her lace curtains seemed to dim in his presence, as if even the sun understood that some conversations were meant to happen in shadows. "You've been living quiet these past 3 years," he said, settling himself into her father's old chair without being asked, his bulk making the worn leather creak in protest. "Keeping to yourself, staying out of trouble, being the kind of woman this town can respect despite your circumstances." His eyes lingered on her scar with the clinical detachment of a man examining a specimen, and Isabella felt herself shrinking back into the familiar pose of shame she had worked so hard to perfect. The way he said circumstances made it sound like her scarred face was a choice she had made, a moral failing rather than the result of her father's drunken rage and a broken whiskey bottle. "But yesterday," he continued, his voice taking on the tone he used when addressing criminals in his jail, "yesterday you made a spectacle of yourself in front of half the town. Let that cowboy put his hands on you where everyone could see. Let him make a show of whatever it was he was doing. The sheriff's mouth twisted with distaste, as if the memory of Nate's gentle kiss left a bitter taste in his mouth. Isabella wanted to defend what had happened, wanted to explain that it had been beautiful rather than shameful, but the words died in her throat under the weight of his disapproval. She had spent too many years learning to apologize for existing to suddenly find the courage to stand up for her right to be loved. Reed leaned forward in his chair, his elbows resting on his knees, his pale eyes fixed on her face with the intensity of a predator studying its prey. "This town has an order to it, Miss Marlowe, a way things are supposed to be, and that order depends on people knowing their place, understanding what's expected of them." His words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of fear that spread through Isabella's chest and settled in her stomach like lead. She understood what he was really saying, understood that her place in Dodge City was to remain invisible, to accept her isolation as the natural consequence of her damaged face, to never reach for anything more than the scraps of pity the town was willing to throw her way. "Now, I've got nothing personal against Nathaniel Hayes," the sheriff said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "He's a good worker, keeps his nose clean, doesn't cause the kind of trouble some of the other cowboys bring to my town. But he's also a man who doesn't understand how things work here, who thinks he can just do whatever strikes his fancy without considering the consequences." Reed's voice carried the weight of years spent maintaining control through fear and intimidation, and Isabella could hear the threat buried beneath his reasonable tone. She thought of Nate's gentle hands, of the way he had looked at her as if she were something precious, and felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her chest like a flame catching dry kindling. The sheriff stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and threatening, and walked to the window where Isabella had been watching Nate just minutes before. "I'd hate to see a good man like Hayes get himself into trouble over a misunderstanding," he said, his back to her, his words floating across the room like smoke from a funeral pyre. "Hate to see him lose his job, or find himself unwelcome in the places where he's used to spending his time. This town can be hard on men who don't respect its traditions, who think they can change the way things have always been." He turned back to face her, and Isabella saw in his eyes the cold calculation of a man who had learned that power came not from what you could build, but from what you could destroy. "I trust you understand what I'm saying, Miss Marlowe," Sheriff Reed said, as he placed his hat back on his head and moved toward the door. "I trust you'll make the right choice about how to handle this situation, for everyone's sake." The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like the lid of a coffin being sealed, and Isabella was left alone with the weight of his words and the terrible knowledge that loving someone in a town like Dodge City could be the most dangerous thing she had ever done. Outside, the morning continued its cheerful progress, but inside her small house, the shadows seemed to have grown longer and darker, and the warmth that Nate's kiss had left in her chest began to feel like something that might burn her alive. The afternoon sun beat down on Dodge City with the relentless intensity of a blacksmith's hammer, turning the dusty streets into rivers of shimmering heat that made the air dance and waver like water. Isabella sat on her back porch, hidden from the main street by the weathered boards of her small house, watching the shadows grow longer as the day wore on toward evening. Her hands worked automatically at the mending in her lap, needle and thread, moving in the familiar rhythm she had learned from her mother. But her mind was miles away, caught between the memory of Nate's kiss and the sheriff's cold warning. The fabric beneath her fingers was soft and worn, a shirt that belonged to Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, and she found herself wondering if the woman who wore it had ever felt the kind of fear that was currently eating away at her insides like acid. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up from her work, and she saw Nate riding toward her house on his bay mare, his silhouette dark against the blazing sky. He moved with the easy grace of a man who had spent his life in the saddle, his body swaying with the horse's rhythm as if they were two parts of the same creature. Isabella's heart began to race, a wild drumbeat that seemed to echo in her ears, and she felt the familiar war between desire and terror that had been raging in her chest since the moment his lips had touched her scar. Part of her wanted to run inside, to hide behind her locked door and pretend she hadn't seen him coming. But another part of her, a part that had been sleeping for 3 long years, wanted to stand up and walk toward him with her head held high. He dismounted at her gate, with the fluid motion of water flowing over stone, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud that seemed to vibrate through the earth and into her bones. Isabella watched him tie his horse to the fence post, his movements unhurried and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world and nowhere else he needed to be. When he turned toward her, she saw that his face carried the same quiet intensity it had worn the day before, the same look of a man who had made a decision and intended to see it through regardless of the consequences. The afternoon light caught the silver threads in his dark hair, and she found herself thinking that he looked like something out of a dream, too good and too dangerous to be real. "Isabella," he said, her name falling from his lips like a prayer, and she felt something inside her chest crack open like an egg, spilling warmth and terror in equal measure. He walked toward her with the measured pace of a man approaching a wild animal, his hands visible and empty, his eyes never leaving her face. She wanted to tell him about the sheriff's visit, wanted to warn him about the danger he was walking into, but the words seemed to stick in her throat like thorns. Instead, she found herself standing up, her mending falling forgotten to the porch boards, her body moving without conscious thought toward the man who had kissed her scars and made her feel human again. "They came to see you, didn't they?" Nate said when he reached the bottom of her porch steps, and Isabella realized that he already knew, had probably known from the moment he decided to come here. His voice carried the weight of a man who had lived through enough small-town politics to understand how the game was played, who knew that love and kindness were often seen as threats to the established order. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and saw something flicker in his eyes that might have been anger or might have been determination. The space between them felt charged with electricity, like the air before a thunderstorm, and Isabella found herself holding her breath, as if the wrong word might shatter whatever fragile thing was growing between them. "I won't let them make you ashamed of what happened yesterday," Nate said, his voice low and fierce, and Isabella felt tears spring to her eyes at the simple kindness of his words. No one had ever stood up for her before, had ever suggested that she deserved better than the scraps of pity and tolerance the town was willing to offer. She thought of all the years she had spent making herself small, all the times she had apologized for taking up space, all the dreams she had buried beneath the weight of other people's expectations. The scar on her face seemed to throb with remembered pain, but for the first time in 3 years, it didn't feel like the most important thing about her. "But I'm scared," she whispered, the words barely audible above the sound of the wind moving through the cottonwood trees that lined her property. "I'm scared of what they'll do to you, of what they'll do to us." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, like admitting to a weakness she had spent years trying to hide. But Nate's face softened with understanding rather than judgment. He climbed the steps slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted to, but Isabella found herself rooted to the spot, caught between the desire to run and the desperate need to be held by someone who saw her as more than just a collection of scars and shame. When he reached for her hands, she let him take them, let him pull her gently toward him until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body like heat from a campfire on a cold night.